Hi everyone, welcome to this course on vulnerability management. In this video, we'll be looking at our third objective, which is why is vulnerability management important and how does it help us to understand our security, our organization security posture. Alright, let's dive in. Alright, so in my previous video, I spoke about what vulnerability management is, what's the difference between vulnerability management and vulnerability assessment. And all of that is to bring us to a point where we begin to ask ourselves, so why is vulnerability management important? And I've actually listed 4 things into explaining the reasons why I feel vulnerability management is very important. And one of the things that vulnerability management helps us to do is that it helps us to be proactive instead of being reactive. And what that means is that it helps us to identify and remedy vulnerabilities before a threat actor does. And most organizations that have suffered security breaches, 95% of them happened because there was a vulnerability that was never patched. There was a vulnerability that they never knew existed in their environment, not to even talk of remediating those vulnerabilities. So one of the things that he does is to ensure that we are aware of those vulnerabilities, and then we remediate those vulnerabilities before a threat actor does. That's number one. Number two is that he helps organizations to be compliant with regulatory standards such as ISO 27001. And ISO 27001 speaks to information management system, and it ensures that one of the controls provided is that every organization must have a technical vulnerability. They must manage how do they manage their technical vulnerabilities, meaning that there should be a security scanning tool in your environment, and that scanning tool should be able to help you identify those vulnerabilities and treat those vulnerabilities and things like that. And when ISO 27001 security auditors come to your environment, one of the things they're always asking for: can you provide us with the vulnerability reports, vulnerability assessment reports? How do you remediate those vulnerabilities? Can you show us how those vulnerabilities are being tracked, and who is and show us if those vulnerabilities have been closed? So those are actually one of the reasons why your vulnerability management should be actually taken seriously. And just because you actually want to be compliant with your vulnerability, compliant with standards such as ISO 27001. And also, one of the things it also does is to help you to identify your risk posture of your organization. So when you want vulnerability assessment tools, which is embedded in your vulnerability management program, those tools help you to identify vulnerabilities, and those tools they categorize those vulnerabilities based on severity levels. They provide additional information in terms of the CVEs, the CVSS score of those vulnerabilities, the solution to remediate those vulnerabilities, many more information as regards even the risk level of that vulnerability. So it helps you to know where you are in terms of your security posture. So if you have a huge amount of critical vulnerabilities, for example, and you when you have that kind of information, it tells to show you, oh, these are the vulnerabilities that we're susceptible to, or these are the threats that we are prone to, depending on the type of business that you do. So it helps you to know where you are, as compared to where you should be, and it helps you to plan where you should be. Most people in security, they call it gap analysis. It helps you to do a gap analysis as to where you are at the moment and where you should be. Okay, and the last thing is that it helps you to finance. It helps you to budget finance to invest in strengthening the security of your organization. Meaning that if, for example, in your security posture, you realize that your perimeter is actually very weak, you can easily be exploited, from external sources. So one of the things that the business owner should start thinking about is, how do we acquire some safeguard or controls to ensure that our perimeter is actually safeguarded, or our perimeter is actually strong. And one of the things you can do is to invest in firewalls, for example, invest in intrusion prevention system or intrusion detection systems. So each of these tools actually cost cost money, and those are the things that will guide your decision making based on your risk posture that you have in your environment. All right. And secondly, another thing I actually want to speak to is the process by which you can actually create your own vulnerability management program. And the image I have here, this is a SANS model. They call it vulnerability management maturity model. It's developed by SANS, and that maturity model has 5 processes, and this is the process by which you can use to actually create, or this process should be included in your vulnerability management program, especially when you want to create a vulnerability management program from scratch, or even if you have an existing vulnerability management program, you should ensure that these processes are actually in place. And the first process here is to prepare. And when we say prepare, it means that you need to have some policy and standards in place to guard your vulnerability management. So meaning that when you want your vulnerability management, you should have a policy in place that would guide your vulnerability management, and that policy should include the following. Number one, it should tell us what is the frequency at which we run our scans. So meaning that, are we going to be running our security assessment, vulnerability assessment once a week, once a year, which I don't recommend? Is it going to be once in a month, or twice in a month, or once in 3 months? That should actually be documented, because it's a process. So that process needs to be followed and actually documented. Secondly, what will be our timeline to remediating vulnerabilities that are identified? How fast? What's the timeline towards to ensuring that we remediate those vulnerabilities? And also, what's our escalation points? How do we escalate vulnerabilities? How do we ensure that those vulnerabilities, what are the measures by which we use to prioritize vulnerabilities? So all of these measures need to be put in place. Also, who are the data owners? We need to know the data owners to ensure that each of those vulnerabilities are remediated by the specific data owners that concerns them. So this policy should have a documented approach to all of our a documented approach as to how we will go about our vulnerability management program. So that process it should be followed and should be documented. And the second stage is identify. So how do we identify vulnerabilities in our environment? What are the how do we ensure that we know those vulnerabilities? So they speak about 3 approaches. There's automated, there's manual, and there's external. So for automated means that we use tools that can automate the discovery of those vulnerabilities. And the different tools, there's Nessus, there's Rapid7, there's OpenVAS, there's Qualys, the F-Secure. There are different tools out there that provide automation in terms of that helps you identify vulnerabilities in your environment. And for manual means that you're going in manually to actually identify those vulnerabilities. So for example, like code review, you're doing a code review, you're doing a static code review to understand the vulnerabilities in the code, for example, in your application, depending on what you're actually trying to assess. But this manual approach means you're going step by step, line by line approach. You're not using any automated tool to do that. And for external actually means, this is where we actually bring about penetration testers to help us identify vulnerabilities in our environments. So penetration testers, they do it at different testing levels. It could be a white box testing, it could be a black box testing, it could be a gray box testing, depending on the testing type of test that is being done. It just helps to ensure to see how we are running, how we are exposed to attack from an external perspective. So those are the 3 methods in which we can identify vulnerability based on SANS approach. And then for analyze, how do we How do we analyze those vulnerabilities that has been identified? What are the criteria we use to identify those vulnerabilities? So vulnerabilities should be prioritized. There are tons amount of vulnerabilities. Whenever you run security vulnerability assessments, using scanning tools, you have a huge amount of vulnerabilities, a huge amount of data that you have, and you can't start remediating each of those vulnerabilities because they are time taken. So you need to be able to choose, you need to be able to prioritize those vulnerabilities and know which one to respond to first, which one you should respond to second, and things like that. So what are the criteria? Some of the criteria use severity levels, which is actually the basics. So severity in terms of critical, in terms of high, in terms of medium, and in terms of low. Those are the severity levels that you can actually use to prioritize your vulnerabilities. Number two, you can also use exploitability. Exploitability in the sense that this particular vulnerability is an exploit code already available to exploit that vulnerability. Can this vulnerability be exploited? It could either be a yes, and it could be a no. And also another thing we'll also be looking at is the impact. What will be the impact if this vulnerability is exploited? So what kind of impact are we going to have? Is it going to be an high impact? Is it going to be a low impact? Is it going to be a medium impact? And that impact could also be categorized. What impact would it have in terms of confidentiality? What impact would it have on our availability of data? And what impact would it have on the integrity of data? So these are some of the critical metrics that could be used to prioritize or analyze a vulnerability. So if that vulnerability has a severity level of critical, for example, it can be exploited. There's an exploit code that could be used to exploit that vulnerability. The impact is high, and it's going to affect. The impact is high, probably on confidentiality. Then we should pay attention to that type of vulnerability. Also, another thing in analyzing is what is the root cause. They also provided an approach as to prioritizing, which is root cause analyzing. So meaning that what is the root cause of this vulnerability? What actually caused this particular vulnerability? Let's say, for example, the vulnerability was caused as a result of using default settings. All right, that's what caused it. So this kind of vulnerability should be prioritized based on some of these criteria I've spoken about. And the other one is how do you communicate these vulnerabilities? In communicating vulnerability, there are different metrics by which you communicate your vulnerabilities. You communicate via email. How do you report those vulnerabilities and things like that? You can even get communication from the vendor. Some vendors send an email that says, our current version of our application is actually vulnerable. Kindly upgrade to the latest version. So you might get an email notification and things like that in terms of but if you want to do your communication internally, how do you communicate those vulnerabilities? And those vulnerabilities should be communicated at two levels. Number one, you should communicate it to the executives, what we call the C-suite, and also to the technical teams. So to the C-suite, what we do is we just provide an overview of those vulnerabilities. How does it affect the business? What are the recommendations we need to ensure that we put in place? What are the high levels that we need to put in place, to ensure that we remediate those vulnerabilities and we have a good grasp of what's going on in terms of our vulnerability management. So first thing, we look at the criticality of those vulnerabilities, how many number of hosts was affected, just at a high level. What are the recommendations to ensure that we put in place to mitigate some of these vulnerabilities that have actually been identified? And technical means we provide the technical details of these vulnerabilities, the affected host, and these technical solutions to remediate those vulnerabilities. So this particular technical detail should be sent to different data owners. So meaning that for application owners, you send specific details to them, to different owners, network owners, you send specific information to them. You just don't send it out to everybody, then you ask them to start picking the one that concerns them. And for treating How do we treat these vulnerabilities that has been identified? Identified three processes: change management. Change management has to do with ensuring that before you treat your vulnerability, it has to go through a change governing board, and those change governing board will approve if that change is if the change is going to be traffic impacting or service impacting. So that change needs to be approved before it is actually implemented. And for patching, also we need to another way of treating vulnerabilities is to patch those vulnerabilities, ensure that those vulnerabilities are patched. Probably you have to upgrade to the latest version, or ensure that you're using the recommendation as specified by the vendor of that particular solution you're trying to patch. And finally, we also have to look at it from a configuration management angle, meaning that if you have, for example, a firewall rule that says permits IP permits any, for example, meaning that you're permitting inbound and outbound traffic, any inbound and outbound traffic into your network, that in itself it's a huge threat, because you're not ensuring that you're not allowing specific traffic into your environment. You're just allowing, so an attacker can actually come in and actually go out of your environment, depending on based on this particular rule. So one of the ways of remediating is to ensure that you provide specific subnets that will be permitted, and so specific subnets or ports that would be denied access into your network. But this is at the configuration level. So these are actually the 5 processes that a vulnerability management solution, a vulnerability management should have when you're creating your vulnerability management process. And they also ensure that each of these processes should go through a maturity level. And that maturity level was developed by CMMI, which is Capability Maturity Model Institute. They came up with 5 levels to improving the processes in which a solution or a program should undergo. And like we said that vulnerability management program should go through 5 processes. Number 1, prepare. Number 2, identify. Number 3, analyze. Number 4, communicate. And number 5 is to treat. So using this CMMI approach, meaning that each of these processes, you definitely will be at different levels at each of these processes, and one of the things you should aspire for is level 5. So meaning that sometimes in your prepare process, you might be at level 2. Identify might be at level 3, depending on each level that you find yourself. But the goal is to ensure that you can reach an optimized level at each of these processes. So let me quickly do an overview of each of these 5 levels and see how they affect vulnerability management. So at the initial stage, this is where everybody starts from. This is more like a 0 stage, where you don't have anything. And at this stage, this is where you've suffered the security breach, and when there's a security incident response came into play, they did all the analysis and they came up with a lesson and they realized that you need to have a vulnerability management solution or vulnerability management tool. So that brings us to the fact that you need to ensure that you have a vulnerability management. So at this stage, this is a level 0 where you don't have anything, and now because you're being reactive, you're considering to have a vulnerability management solution in your environment. And at this level 2, meaning that you've decided based on the security breach you suffered to have a vulnerability management solution. So at this stage, you already have a vulnerability management solution, and it's not really so structured. You're beginning into being you're trying to install a scanner, for example, in your environment to be able to help you manage your vulnerabilities and things like that. So at this level, this is the level 2, where you're bringing your vulnerability management tool on board. And also the defined level now means that you already have a vulnerability management vulnerability management solution in place. It's running properly. You have all your policies in place. You have your remediation team. You have you treat your vulnerabilities. You go through all of the 5 processes. So at this stage, you already have everything done, and you're being proactive. So now you run your scans probably once in a month or twice in a month and things like that. And for a level 4, this is when you now begin to ensure that this is, I call it, when you begin, this is where I call the mid level. So at this level, this is when you begin to quantify your process, in the sense that we begin to ask ourselves, what vulnerabilities was recorded this week? How are we tracking those vulnerabilities? How many of those vulnerabilities have been treated? What are the reasons why these vulnerabilities have not been treated? What are the escalation points? How do we ensure that our vulnerabilities are properly treated? And things like that. So at this level, this is where you're beginning to manage, or you're beginning to correlate your vulnerability, your scanner. You're correlating it with a SIEM solution. You're correlating it with your your endpoint detection and response solution. So here you're beginning to gather more information, and trying to measure the vulnerabilities and the remediation in your environment. And the last stage is the optimization process. This is where you begin to look at how do we improve this process. So for example, let's say, how do we improve our identifying process in the vulnerability management program? So one of the things you might be looking at, okay, why don't we integrate it with the SIEM solution, so that we have all of our we have a centralized location whereby we're managing our vulnerability solution, and we have multiple people paying attention to it, which is our SOC team. So this is where you're looking at how do you optimize those things. In terms of remediation, how do we assign tickets? Who do we assign to remediate these vulnerabilities? How are we tracking these vulnerabilities? So at this level, this is where we are thinking of additional ways of optimizing each of the process. So for prepare, for example, you might say, okay, why don't you just have a policy management solution to help us optimize our policy, our prepare process, in the vulnerability management solution, in our vulnerability management program. So these are all of the 5 levels that we should be that we need to look at in terms of measuring our vulnerability management process. All right, so I hope you find this video valuable. Thank you very much for viewing this long. Kindly like, share and subscribe to this video, and I hope to see you in my next video.